Jules, thank you for that. They say there's nothing like a good introduction, and that was nothing like a good introduction, so thank you very much. Actually, that was way over the top, totally over-exaggerated, and I think over-zealous, flourishing introduction, which I have to admit was pretty much exactly the same as the one I emailed you yesterday, so you kind of got that one spot on, and I appreciate it. So for me, it's fantastic to be back here, because many, many decades ago, I was here in this college and had a fantastic time. You know, at that time, this was a pretty traditional place and a traditional city. We used to say Dublin was male, pale, and stale in those days. It wasn't a very cosmopolitan, international city to live in. I remember back then going into a restaurant and asking the waiter, "What's the soup du jour?" And he said, "Hang on, I'll find out. I'll go in and ask the chef." So he goes in and asks the chef, and he comes out and he says, "It's soup of the day," right? So that was the world back then. But now, it's so different. This country, this city is so different. Having lived and worked in 6 countries around the world, I spent a chunk of most of my career overseas, I come back to this city. Now here's some interesting statistics. 12% of the population of the United States were not born in the United States. In Ireland, it's 17%. In Dublin, it's 25%. But of the working age population of Dublin, 33% were not born in Ireland. So we're looking at a totally and utterly different city, different environment. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself, does your network reflect the diversity of the city, of the economy, of the society in which you live and operate? And most people have to say no. In fact, all the research shows, the McKinseys and the Bains, that if you don't reflect that diversity, you as an organization underperform. And if your network doesn't reflect that, so does you underperform. So we live in an extraordinary time. We live in many ways in the best of times. This is the healthiest time in the history of mankind. This is the wealthiest time in the history of mankind. This is the most peaceful time in the history of mankind. We are living longer than ever before. 60% of the people who reach 60 in Ireland will reach 90. Just imagine that. Kids born today will live to well over 100. So it is the best of times, but it's also, bizarrely, the worst of times. There is such concern, tension, stress in this world. There was a study done by Gallup a couple of years ago, global study, that found that 85% of people at work in the world are disengaged. What an extraordinarily sad statistic in many ways. And Edelman, the world's #1 communications company, every year does a thing called the Edelman Trust Survey. And they found, and they announced this during Davos this year, that trust in 4 institutions, government, media, non-profits, and the whole society in general, is at its lowest level in recorded history. So we're living in a distrustful and extraordinary, sort of disengaged world. And then we wonder why Brexump, I call it Brexump, happened. So that's the challenge that we face here. The worst of times, the best of times. But I love what you're doing, Jules and Amr. I love what Simon's doing, and he's going to talk about the good country. And here we have this good summit, because this is the early days, I think, of something kind of special. And when you think about it, nobody ever started a large company. Apple Computer started when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak came together and put some bits and pieces together and made the first computer out of a garage. Walt Disney, first cartoon came out of a shed. In another garage, you 2 guys, one called Hewlett and one called Packard. Zuckerberg started Facebook in a dormitory. In 1985, a plane took off from Waterford and landed in London with 15 passengers. The first ever flight of Ryanair. And they had 120 million passengers they'll do this year. That's not just the business world. Pieta House started with just a group of people going for a walk, and now hundreds of thousands do their walk every year. There's an organization called Men's Sheds. which came from Australia, as for men to get engaged in carpentry and various other activities. There's now 400 of these around Ireland. And I worked for one of these non-profits called the Ireland Funds, which was an idea, just like the idea you guys have. The idea came up with two individuals in Pittsburgh in the United States, a guy called Tony O'Reilly, an Irish guy who ran the H.J. Heinz Food Company, and Dan Rooney, who owned the Pittsburgh Steelers. They had an idea, and the idea they had was there is such a thing as an Irish empire, not built by military might or force of arms, but the fact that so many Irish people left this country. And they went all over the world, and they built these networks. And so Tony and Dan decided, could we corral this support to get them to help, particularly the issues in Northern Ireland? They didn't really know, but they held a dinner, a big black tie, fundraising dinner in the Waldorf Astoria, the great and the good. The dinner was so unsuccessful. The only reason they had a second dinner a year later was to pay for the first dinner they had. And that's $600 million ago. So an organization which started with a failure went on to great success. It's now in 39 cities in 13 countries. It was actually modeled on what the Jewish community in the United States did to support Israel. Could the Irish in the US and elsewhere support Ireland? Tony O'Reilly is a funny speaker, some of you may know. And on that first occasion, we had a slogan, peace, culture, charity. He said we're going to change it to look Irish, dress British, think Yiddish. If you could get those, if you could get those three things in alignment, you'd be on to a winner. And of course, he was right. So I was lucky enough to work for them for 21 years, lived a lot of time in Boston, started off in Sydney, but I realized something. There was a piece of glue that made all this happen. And the glue was building networks, which is what you're doing here today. What Simon's talking about with the good country is, can you build networks, but can you build global networks? We did it with the Irish diaspora, and many other countries now are trying to do the same thing. I'm a founder member of an organization called CASE, which stands for Copy and Steal Everything. Figure out who's doing something really well, and can you take the best elements of it and make it work? So here's what's interesting about networks and networking. Everybody hates networking. It's got a lousy, sleazy image. It conjures up images of sort of very insincere, inauthentic people pushing out business cards late at night. You know, you wake up in the morning, you find somebody's business card and they turn up your trousers, you wonder, where did that come from? And that's the kind of image of networking. Also, networking is not taught at school or college. In this great, august institution of Trinity College, you will learn great things and many things, but they won't teach you networking. And yet, one introduction, one conversation can change your life. It certainly happened to me, and I'm sure to many people here. Because you know, life is a game of inches. The difference between success and failure, the difference between coming first and second is tiny. I used to work for the IDA, inward investment into Ireland. If we won an inward investment decision, fantastic. If we came second, we got nothing. Huge price to be paid. So networking is an important thing. It's important to become good at this stuff. It's important that you learn the skills. It's important for your own career. There's a guy called Harvey Coleman, wrote some interesting stuff in America. He said, your career progress depends on a concept he calls PIE, P-I-E, performance and image and exposure. And he said, how well you do your job contributes 10% to your career progress, which seems bizarre. Surely how well you do your job is everything. He says, no. How well you do your job, it gets you on the ladder. It doesn't get you up the ladder. You get paid on performance. You get promoted on what other people think of your potential. So now other things come into play. The I, which he says is 30% of your career, depends on your image, what people think of you. What's your reputation? What do people say about you when you're not in the room? And then 60% is exposure. Who's seen you in action? Who's got your back? What does your boss think of you? What's your boss's boss think of you? So all of these things become really important. And the reason I'm particularly interested in networking is that all the research shows that while it's great and helpful for the various things you want for yourself, People who have strong and diverse networks, the diverse piece is important. Live longer, I like that. They earn more money, certainly like that. They're stronger mentally and physically, and they're happier. And I believe the great crisis of our times is actually loneliness. And networking is an antidote to loneliness. So what this is about is actually social capital, building your social capital. Your financial capital, your money and your possessions, your house and your car and your stocks, all good stuff. You have to have that. And your human capital is up here, it's what you know. But your social capital is between you and other people. The resources available to you in your personal and business networks, they are going to determine. You can't go it alone. The Marlborough Man, the Lone Ranger approach to life just quite simply doesn't work. Which again is why I'm interested in this concept and Simon's concept about identifying people who share these particular interests wherever they are. We all tend to work in silos. Our networks help us break out of those silos. But you won't build a network unless you get comfortable talking to strangers. And what do we teach our kids? Don't talk to strangers. And yet our kids are more risk from friends and family statistically than they are from strangers. So you need certain skills to be good at networking. I'll leave you with the 5 skills to be great at networking. The number 1 skill is to be a world-class listener. And here's the problem. We live in a world where nobody listens. The only reason people listen is to prepare what they're going to say next, not to hear what somebody is saying. We think listening is a form of weakness. We think listening is a display of not being an expert. All we want to do is to jump in and wow people with what we know. We're narcissistic listeners. So if I say to Jules, I'm just thinking of buying a car, and he says, I bought one last week. I paid 10 grand, he wanted 15. It's only done 30,000 miles. I've no interest in him and his car. I want to talk about, but that's not the way the life is. And interestingly enough, the guy who nailed all this stuff many, many years ago has a book that's in every airport today, in every city in the world. Dale Carnegie wrote a book about all of this stuff. And he said some really simple stuff that I think remains as relevant today as ever. He said, the sweetest sound that anybody ever heard is the sound of their own name. He said, the smile on your face is more important than the clothes on your back. He said, to be interesting, be interested. He said, a really good question beats a really good comment. He said, the boil on the back of the neck of the person you're speaking to means more to them than 6 earthquakes in India. And many other slightly folksy things. So listening, important. Second concept I love is funnels of serendipity. How random chance can change your life. As I said earlier, one introduction, one conversation. That's why we do stuff like this. The opportunities to bounce in, to meet people that we don't know, who tell us things we don't know, introduce us to people we don't know. And this idea that you can make luck happen in your life. Put it this way, luck doesn't happen lying in bed or sitting at your desk. Luck happens when you're in motion. Luck happens when you're doing stuff. Luck happens when you put your talents on display. So serendipity is important. The third, we have to accept and work with technology. And to be a great networker, you have to be high tech and high touch. And the balance is very much towards tech now. And one of the challenges for the millennial generation is to consistently build on the high touch, to make sure that they're speaking as much as they're talking. The fourth one is build weak connections. The concept of homophily is that we tend to always hang around with people just like us. We go to school with them, we play sports with them, we socialize with them, we go on holidays with them, we work with them, we marry them, we produce more of them, but that's not what the world out there is. So we have to find a way to build a wide array of weak connections. And ironically, your weak connections are more helpful than your strong connections because they bridge you into different networks and different places and different types of people. And so these are the sorts of things that you need. You need to think about these things. And fifthly and finally, networking is all about giving, not getting. We think networking we've got to do because we want something for ourselves. But actually, if you turn that on its head and say, I'm going to find a way to give, to put my network at your disposal, to find ways to help other people, what happens is you give to individuals and it comes back from the network. So let me finish with the great company Google, who was founded by two brilliant technicians, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And they did some research a couple of years ago to figure out what makes a great leader in Google. Because traditionally, all they did was hire people who had first-class degrees in science and technology, PhDs, masters in this stuff. And they came up with you need 8 characteristics to be a great leader in Google. And the 8th and least important, they discovered, was technical ability. And all the others were what you might call soft skills. All the others were to do with collaborating, listening, coaching, mentoring, volunteering, working in groups. The old days of hierarchical structures have been broken down. It's now circles, it's now teams. So I think that's what this event today reflects. These are some of the tools that I've used over the years that I now spend teaching here in Dublin and elsewhere. I think you're going to have a fantastic today. Look forward to meeting as many people as possible, and thank you for listening.